He stood alone in front of 200 armed men, and they laid down their weapons. It sounds like a legend. It sounds impossible. But the tactic behind that moment, the art of convincing an enemy that what you do not have is everywhere, helped shape one of the decisive days of the 20th century. June 6, 1944. Dawn over Normandy. Landing craft rode the swells. Planes cut the early sky. Men climbed down rope ladders into cold water and ran toward cliffs and wire and gunfire. The beaches filled with smoke and the thin, focused noise of war. That violent, chaotic reality was one half of the page. Far away from the surf, another page sat quiet on the desk of a single man, folded and unread. Back at the dictator's headquarters, there was a different kind of mourning. Reports arrived in stacks. Radio messages pinged across slow circuits. Field commanders sent urgent requests. But the room where those messages mattered most was dark. The leader of Germany, who liked to keep the rhythm of his day controlled and sacred, was asleep. His staff hesitated. His temper was feared. Officers tucked reports aside rather than risk a confrontation. Hours began to leak like water through a crack. Deception worked in that gap. Allied planners had spent months manufacturing a false truth. They built a ghost army, fake tanks, dummy landing craft, a tapestry of false radio chatter, and deliberately leaked intelligence created the illusion of force where there was none. They elevated one general to the center of the lie, a hard-charging, believable figure who would become the focal point of German attention. Planes and submarines and actors of war rehearsed a story. We are coming at Calais. The real target, Normandy, would go almost unnoticed because the Germans were made to see, hear, and believe the lie. Operation Fortitude was not a single trick. It was an atmosphere of false certainty pressed onto an enemy already wired to read the world in familiar patterns. The Allies knew that a slow, centralized command could be paralyzed by persuasion. They knew that if the Germans could be convinced, the main assault was somewhere else. The powerful armored reserves, the panzers, would be held in place, waiting for the phantom strike. Reports from the north coast of France arrived in front of the man who had the final say. Commanders in the field, men who watched paratroopers fight in hedgerows, who saw ships unloading men and supplies under fire, sent messages begging for permission to move their armored divisions. They needed to strike while the window of opportunity remained open. They needed to blunt the assault before the Allied foothold hardened into a beachhead. When the reports reached the sleeping leader, what followed is now a warning in the study of command. He was reportedly briefed and reportedly dismissed the landings as a feint. This is not the real invasion, witnesses later wrote. Whether he spoke the exact words matters less than the choice they contained, a refusal to accept the accumulated weight of evidence. He controlled the release of reserves. He demanded certainty over counsel. The panzers, the most mobile and decisive force Germany had, were kept back. Delay on a battlefield is not an abstract sin. Delay is a growing advantage for the other side. Every hour the enemy waits is an hour for the attackers to move from vulnerable to fortified. Positions dug, anti-tank guns sighted, infantry reorganized, communications glued together. The Allies had a terrible and effective gift: air supremacy. Once the panzers finally rumbled out toward the beaches, Allied planes saw them. Aircraft that had been strafing supply lines and command posts now turned on convoys and columns. Tanks and transport were cut down long before they could reach the fight. The window that could have allowed a swift armored counterattack, measured in hours, not days, slammed shut. Historians reasonably estimate that the delay amounted to roughly 10 to 12 hours before significant armored forces could be committed. In that time, tens of thousands of Allied soldiers had established positions. Anti-tank obstacles were in place, and reinforcements were ferried across open water. By the evening of D-Day, the beachheads held. In the following days, the Allies poured men and material ashore until, within weeks, a permanent lodgment on the continent existed. The failure to act swiftly, the insistence on personal control and absolute certainty, turned an emergency into a strategic defeat for the Germans and opened the Western Front that would ultimately hasten the collapse of Nazi Germany. There is a brutal arithmetic to those hours wasted. Centralized authority plus stubborn judgment equals lost opportunity. The happy story of the invasion courage on the beaches, sacrifice in the hedgerows remains true. But that courage might have been suffocated if a single man had chosen differently. If a leader had trusted his field commanders. If an ego had yielded to fact. Instead, a manufactured narrative operation fortitude meant a closed mind, and the result reshaped the war. What would you do if your leader slept through history? What costs follow when decisions are chained to a single will? Those are not hypothetical questions in the study of command. They are practical, lethal variables. If you want the full breakdown of what really happened that day and why it matters, hit subscribe now and stay with us to the end. The irony of fortitude is instructive. The Allies did not simply outfight the Germans, they outconvinced them. They built a lie resilient enough to change how the enemy interpreted its own intelligence. Where the German command demanded proof beyond the ordinary signals of war, Allied deception supplied a pattern so complete it reduced doubt. And in a system where one man held the keys to the most important decisions, certainty was weaponized against flexibility. That is the strategic heart of the story. Psychological force can amplify material weakness. A bluff, when expertly constructed, becomes a force multiplier, but only against an opponent whose decision mechanisms are brittle and centralized. Against a more diffuse, responsive adversary, the same bluff collapses quickly. Against a command that trusted field expertise, the Allies would have found panzers meeting them on the beaches. Against a leader who listened, the story might have been different. When the panzers finally moved, after the fatal pause, they moved into a storm. Allied air power slashed at columns. Anti-tank guns hidden in the dunes and hedgerows waited. Men who had been thrown into the crucible of the landing adjusted and pushed outward. The tactical advantage that would have come from a swift armored response dissolved. The strategic advantage passed to the Allies. The cascade was not instantaneous, but it was relentless. From troubled hours to entrenched footholds, to a steady build-up of men and machines. Normandy ceased to be a temporary beachhead and became the cornerstone of the liberation of Western Europe. Leadership failure at the top had consequences not only for generals and governments, but for the lives of thousands who fought and died on sand and in orchards. We honor the sacrifice and condemn the decisions that could have made it unnecessary. Dramatized vignette, inspired by tactics from D-Day. A lone scout in a tattered greatcoat walked into a village square at dusk. He carried nothing but an old radio transmitter, a flare pistol, and a confidence that did not match his numbers. 200 enemy soldiers watched from windows and shadowed alleys. Their captain leaned on a lamppost, certain of victory in the light of superior arms. The scout raised the radio, and, with fingers that didn't shake, imitated voices in different accents and different commands. He sent a burst of static, and then a measured report. A phantom brigade was on the march. Artillery positions were being registered. Paratroopers were dropping behind the town. He fired his flare. From the hills, hidden men dropped more flares in deliberate pattern. The enemy looked out and saw light, heard the radio, felt the rhythm of reinforcements arranging themselves. Panic is contagious when information is thin and fear is thick. The captain ordered a reconnaissance and found empty fields, bootprints and canvas impressions, but no massed tanks. The scout's bluff supplied a plausible, dangerous alternative. If he was wrong and a full force arrived, they would be trapped. Better to avoid a gamble with an unknown outcome. The captain ordered a withdrawal. The 200 men stacked their rifles and left the square in single file. The scout walked away from the empty weapons, and the sudden quiet. He did not win by muscle. He won by shaping what the enemy believed about the present. He converted absence into presence, uncertainty into a weapon. End of vignette. That vignette is fiction, but it is not fantasy. It captures a principle. Perception can be engineered, and engineered perception can change the course of events. The Allies used this idea on a strategic scale with fortitude. The Germans, anchored by a centralized command structure and a leader who demanded absolute clarity before action, were vulnerable to a convincing illusion. What remains after the drama of June 6th is not only a map changed by invasion. It is a lesson about leadership. Command must be resilient. Good leaders empower trusted subordinates to act when time is the enemy. They accept uncomfortable evidence. They build systems that turn raw intelligence into rapid responses rather than waiting for perfection. When power is concentrated and decisions are personal, the cost of error multiplies. This is not an abstract critique of historical figures. It is a practical warning. In any organization, military, political, corporate, or civic, the same dynamic can play out. A moment arrives that demands action, and an unwillingness to cede control can turn opportunity into failure. Pride becomes a tactical liability. Delay becomes a strategic defeat. Remember, too, the other side of the coin, the morality of deception in war. The Allies' bluff saved lives in the long view by preventing a slaughter on the beaches that might have turned the tide. The tactic relied on ingenuity, patience, and a willingness to accept moral complexity for a higher end. Tactics are tools. Their ethical evaluation depends on outcomes and intentions. In this case, deception broke the backbone of a murderous regime and helped bring an end to a catastrophic war. History is full of these hinge moments. A door that could have been closed was left ajar. A man who slept through reports held back forces that might have changed destiny. A carefully constructed lie met a brittle will, and the result was a turning point. If you want a deeper dive into the planning behind Operation Fortitude, the airborne operations that secured the flanks, and the leadership decisions that followed on both sides, check out the playlist linked now. Learn not just what happened, but how decisions, timing, and the psychology of command shaped the outcome, and how those lessons still matter when the stakes are life and death.